Hello and welcome to Module 3 of Risk-Based Decision Making. Today we're going to talk about generating options. So our learning objectives for this module are to be aware of the best practices for generating options for decision making based on decision analysis research, and then also to understand how the consequences of a decision are generated for informing the decision. There is one reading on Karman that covers this material. It's chapter 4 from the Smart Choices book that we read in the last module. There's also a case study in the Karman reading. It's a little technical, and certainly you don't need to understand all of the content of it, and maybe you could watch the module and then refer back to it, but I am going to use examples of decision outcomes and decision options from that paper. So I put it up on Karman so you could refer to it later if that would be helpful. It's a study on the application of multi-criteria decision analysis to a food safety decision-making problem from 2008. Okay, so back to decision analysis and how it relates to risk-based decision-making. So a couple of important findings in decision analysis are that the generation of options from which to choose is often not given enough attention. It's common in my experience when I worked for the government and in the United States that there would be one option presented and people say, here's what we want to do and here's all the things it's going to do, and they just want the decision maker to say yes or no. But that is really a suboptimal decision process because it's not just a yes or no question, it's a if you say no, what else happens, and what are the other options that could be related to this, that could be similar, that you could also choose from. So ideally, you would have a set of options to choose from. So I have a brainstorming graphic on this slide, noting that, before you think about moving forward with a decision, you want to make sure you have all the options available. So you want to make sure you brainstorm, you put your heads together, you do research to identify other possible options that could be selected before moving into the decision-making process. So spending this time generating possible options is often overlooked. It's often kind of brushed past. People often make their decision about which option they think is best, and then they just want to take that forward to the decision maker to have that person say yes or no, see if they could convince them. But that's often leads to less than good decision making. Another thing that's important to think about is you always should include the status quo option, which is the no option, right? So if you could make a change and you decide you're not going to make a change, what is it going to look like in terms of those outcomes that you care about? What is the status quo? What is the current state of affairs on that particular issue? So it's important to set aside time before you start digging into the analysis and trying to come up with all the numbers. That's something we analysts are very good at. We want to kind of crunch the numbers, get the data, see what the results say. But you want to also make sure that you're including enough options in the alternative and that you're analyzing all those options so that it will be a full and good decision-making process. So thinking about the outcomes you've identified, the things that you care about, the things we talked about in Module 2, the risk metrics, other things like cost and so on, thinking about those might help you identify additional options. So again, this is the consequence table from last time. It's where we're going to have the outcomes are across the top of the table here, labeled generically, and then we'll fill it in through the rest of this module. So we want to have the status quo option, that's kind of the current state, and then we would add other options, option 1, option 2, and others. Hopefully at least you're going to have a status quo and then 2 other options to compare it to. If you're having a hard time coming up with other options, it's fine to, probably make tweaks to the different option or kind of do some research to find other options so that you can have that for comparison. So now I'm going to show you this example from the case study that I mentioned. So in this paper, it was a general paper. It wasn't about a specific type of intervention, but they were focused on reducing microbial contamination. So that was the decision, was that there was some situation in which they were trying to reduce microbial contamination. And in their research and in their work to generate options, they identified these 5 different options for reducing contamination. So the other thing they did was before they started generating options, they looked at what were the outcomes that they care about. So here you can see the outcomes, and these are all really well described in the paper. So I suggest you can look to that paper for more information than what I'm going to share now. The first outcome was the weight of the evidence. So that's really kind of how much uncertainty do you have in these results? How strong is the evidence? Was it just one study? Was it several studies? Were they recent studies? Those kinds of criteria about the quality of the evidence. Then the effectiveness, so if it's a certain kind of intervention you're trying to do to reduce contamination, how effective was it? How much did the contamination get reduced through this intervention? There's also an outcome related to cost, because of course that's an important consideration whenever you're trying to implement something. Things that are too costly probably won't get, unless they're, they have to be balanced with their effectiveness. And then practicality, which really gets to the question of how will it be implemented in the current system? How many changes have to be made? Is it something that could be easily done, or is it something that would be a huge effort for them to take? So So this is the consequence table that we're going to look at, and it shows, again, the outcomes across the top and then the different interventions down the side. So then what you would do to fill in the consequences would be to start looking at the data, the information you have to start filling these in. So once the outcomes and options are defined, then you do this assessment of consequence. So the data that you use for this will vary. Sometimes you'll have scientific research studies that will give you the information. Sometimes, like in this paper, you have to go out and collect the information from different studies. Sometimes you don't have exactly the data that you want, so you have to use proxy data, which I'll talk about here. So there's all different ways that you might fill in this data, but it is important to get data on all of the outcomes that you care about. So this first criteria is weight of evidence, and I decided to operationalize that, if you will, to represent that with kind of low, medium, and high. So what you're seeing here, and this doesn't necessarily match what was in the paper, I just generated these on my own. They had much more detail in the paper. So they're saying, okay, options A and B have a pretty low weight of evidence. That's important to understand. C and E have a high level, and D has a medium. So again, part of the work the analyst does is to organize the information that you have on these options into these categories of outcomes. Then they say they had these studies that showed different levels of reduction that you see here. Say they had different levels of cost. You could actually put the numbers into these columns, or you could kind of represent the relative cost like I did with these dollar signs. And then you could have a measure of practicality. So again, these were the outcomes that the decision maker said that he cared about, and they wanted to have represent this all in a table that really lays out, okay, these are all the options that you have, and this is all the information you have about those options. So using a consequence table like this without even any other analysis beyond here is a huge step forward in decision making, because it really clarifies, number one, what are the things you care about in the decision, what are the outcomes you're tracking, and number two, how do the different options differ on those outcomes? So that information alone can help you understand kind of if there's one or two options that really are better than all the other ones, then you could maybe narrow down your thinking to those. It helps if someone else is thinking of a different option that's not on the list, it would be pretty obvious right away. And if someone else is thinking of other outcomes that aren't on the list, it would be clear right away that the decision maker didn't take that into account. So recall the PROACT model that was from the Smart Choices book. So when we determine options, like we just talked about, we're generating these alternatives. And when we assess the outcomes, we're generating consequences. So we're working our way through the steps in this model in these two modules. So just to recap the learning objectives is that you would be aware of the best practices for generating options in decision making, and then also understand how the consequences of a decision are generated for informing the decision. Thanks.